Evan Carver and Caleb Rowen were two ordinary men in a quiet town, but behind their seemingly normal lives hid secrets so dark that their collision ended in a murder so brutal, even seasoned investigators were left shaken. Ridgeway Valley had always been the kind of place people described as calm, slow, and safe. It was surrounded by soft green hills, long stretches of farmland, and a river that moved so quietly it felt like part of the silence. Families who had lived there for generations took pride in the peaceful routine that rarely changed. Children walked to school without fear, neighbors greeted each other every morning, and the people trusted the familiar faces around them. Outsiders often said the town looked frozen in time, untouched by the chaos of bigger cities. That sense of safety became almost a part of the town's identity, something everyone believed in without question. As the seasons passed, Ridgeway Valley remained steady. Summer brought small festivals in the park, autumn turned the trees golden, and winter wrapped the town in soft layers of snow. Even the local police station operated more like a community center than a hub of emergencies. Officers handled lost pets, minor disputes, and the occasional traffic complaint. Nothing ever suggested the town would face something dark or disturbing. The peaceful environment made people feel protected, as if tragedy could never cross into their lives. But beneath that quiet surface, subtle things were changing, though no one noticed. Rumors of unfamiliar cars driving through late at night were dismissed as visitors. Strange lights near the old industrial area were ignored. Everyone trusted that Ridgeway Valley was simply not the place where anything dangerous happened. That shared belief created a false comfort, a blind spot that allowed something unimaginable to unfold without warning. Early March arrived with cold winds and pale mornings. The town was slowly preparing for spring, expecting nothing more than the usual shift in weather. Shops opened on time. Farmers began clearing their fields, and people went about their routines with the same confidence they always had. Yet the atmosphere felt slightly different, almost heavy, though residents could not explain why. It was as if the town itself sensed the storm that was coming. The abandoned greenhouse on the edge of Ridgeway Valley had been forgotten for years. It once belonged to a rare botanist who moved away, leaving the structure to rot. Most people avoided that area because it looked eerie at night. But even then, no one believed it held any danger. It was simply another reminder of the town's quiet past. But in the days leading up to the crime, several residents reported a strange smell drifting from that direction. Some thought it was burning trash. Others assumed the wind carried the odor from nearby farms. No one considered checking the place. Everything changed on a single morning, when a jogger took a different route than usual, unknowingly stepping into the start of a nightmare. What they found behind the greenhouse tore through the town's sense of peace like a blade. Ridgeway Valley, once proud of its untouched calm, would never be the same again. A darkness had arrived, one so shocking that even the most experienced investigators would struggle to understand it. The town that had always felt safe was about to be remembered for something far more haunting. The morning was colder than usual, and a thin fog hung over Ridgeway Valley, softening the edges, trees, and houses. The streets were nearly empty, except for a few early risers. Among them was a local jogger, someone who had taken the same path for years without incident. That morning, however, instinct, or perhaps boredom, led them to veer slightly off their usual route. The air smelled strange, carrying a hint of smoke that did not belong to any fireplace or nearby farm. It was subtle at first, almost dismissible, but persistent enough to make the jogger pause and look around. The source of the odor came from the edge of town, near an abandoned greenhouse that had long been left to decay. Windows were shattered, wooden beams sagged under the weight of years, and weeds grew so thick that the entrance looked like it had never been crossed. Yet, the smell was stronger near a cluster of old wooden crates stacked haphazardly beside the greenhouse. Curiosity pushed the jogger closer, and what they saw would forever haunt their memory. A human body, partially hidden under the crates, was discovered in a state that no one in the town had ever imagined. The sight was grotesque, but more than that, it carried a sense of deliberate cruelty. Whoever had done this had planned it carefully, leaving signs of extreme rage in every detail. The remains were battered and torn, showing that the attack had not been impulsive but calculated. Investigators later described it as a scene so horrifying that even seasoned detectives had trouble processing what they were seeing. It was the kind of violence that seemed almost unnatural, a brutality that surpassed mere anger and spoke of obsession or deep-seated malice. Within minutes, the local authorities arrived, quickly cordoning off the area. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering theories and anxiously scanning the foggy edges of the scene. The greenhouse, once forgotten, was now the center of horror and speculation. Forensic teams moved with careful precision, photographing every detail, collecting samples, and attempting to make sense of the chaos. There were no immediate signs of forced entry, but evidence suggested the victim had been lured there or brought in under false pretenses. Every clue seemed to raise more questions than it answered, adding layers of mystery that confounded the investigators. As the day progressed, word of the discovery spread through Ridgeway Valley like wildfire. Families kept their doors locked for the first time in decades. Parents held their children closer, and friends looked at one another with suspicion, unable to believe that such a violent act could happen in their peaceful town. The jogger who discovered the body was taken in for questioning, their recollections shaky and filled with disbelief. Even for those who were not present at the scene, the image of the greenhouse and the hidden body created a pervasive sense of fear. The air, once calm and comforting, now seemed heavy and threatening. By evening, the initial shock had begun to settle, but it was replaced by an unsettling realization. Ridgeway Valley was no longer a safe haven. The brutality of the crime left an impression that would linger for months, even years. Investigators worked tirelessly to gather evidence, trying to understand the who, why, and how of such a violent act. But the deeper they dug, the more complex and disturbing the case became. What began as a morning jog through foggy streets had turned into a nightmare that would unravel secrets no one in the town could have anticipated. The victim, soon identified as Evan Carver, was the kind of man everyone in Ridgeway Valley thought they knew. At first glance, he seemed ordinary, polite, helpful, and unassuming. He worked as a handyman, repairing fences, fixing leaky taps, and helping neighbors with small construction projects. People often described him as dependable, someone who could be counted on when things needed to be done. Children waved at him while he worked in their yards, and older residents trusted him with minor repairs without hesitation. To the community, Evan appeared to live a quiet, simple life that matched the town's slow and predictable rhythm. No one suspected that behind his unremarkable appearance lay a hidden world of secrecy and danger. As investigators began piecing together Evan's life, a pattern emerged that contradicted everything his neighbors believed. He had been living a double life for years, though no one outside his inner circle could have guessed it. He frequently traveled to distant towns under the pretense of work or personal errands, often returning late at night with excuses that seemed plausible at the time. In reality, these trips involved meetings that were never discussed with anyone. Multiple phones, each registered under different names, were discovered in his home, along with a collection of prepaid cards and envelopes containing cash. These items suggested financial dealings far beyond the earnings of a small-town handyman, raising suspicions that Evan's life was not as simple as it appeared. Records obtained by the investigators revealed that Evan had connections in other regions, and some of these contacts were linked to illegal activities. He appeared to act as a middleman, moving goods and handling transactions that required discretion. There was no evidence of direct violence in his past, but the complexity of his secret dealings suggested that he navigated a world where risk and danger were constants. Every detail about his private life painted a picture of someone who had carefully crafted an outwardly ordinary persona while concealing activities that could provoke serious consequences if discovered. Friends and neighbors were stunned as the truth about Evan slowly unfolded. Those who had trusted him completely could not reconcile the image of their helpful handyman with the reality of the man investigators were describing. The duality of his life created confusion and fear. How could someone so familiar, someone so ordinary in appearance, be involved in dangerous activities that ultimately led to his own death? It became clear that his murder was not a random act of violence but the result of hidden conflicts and dangerous connections that had remained invisible to the outside world. Further investigation revealed that Evan had been meticulous in covering his tracks. His home showed no obvious signs of illegal activity, and his interactions with neighbors remained friendly and innocent. Yet the smallest traces, financial records, travel documents, and personal items, exposed a life built on secrecy. Investigators realized that uncovering his hidden life was key to understanding the motive behind his murder. Each new piece of evidence added layers of complexity, demonstrating that Evan's death was not merely tragic but part of a story far darker than anyone in Ridgeway Valley could have imagined. By the time all of this was revealed, the town began to feel a deep sense of unease. The man they thought they knew, the familiar face they trusted, had been living among them with secrets that ultimately proved fatal. Evan Carver's double life became the focal point of the investigation, offering clues, but also creating more questions than answers. Ridgeway Valley had always believed in safety and transparency, but the reality of Evan's life showed that appearances could be dangerously deceptive. The peaceful town was beginning to understand that behind even the most ordinary lives, darkness could quietly thrive, waiting for the moment to surface with devastating consequences. The greenhouse where Evan Carver's body was discovered became the focal point of a detailed and painstaking investigation. From the moment forensic teams arrived, it was clear that the scene contained more than just the victim. It held a trail of cryptic clues that seemed deliberately placed. Among the most puzzling items were objects that appeared completely unrelated to Evan himself. A luxury watch, polished and seemingly untouched, lay beside the body, positioned almost ceremoniously. Its origin was unknown, and it did not belong to Evan. For investigators, the presence of the watch raised immediate questions. Why leave such an item so carefully? Was it a message, a distraction, or evidence planted to mislead? Every possibility seemed plausible, but none offered clear answers. In addition to the watch, there was soil scattered across the greenhouse floor that did not match the surrounding area. Laboratory analysis revealed that the soil came from a location several miles away, one that had no obvious connection to Evan or his daily life. Investigators speculated on why it had been brought there. Could it have been transferred inadvertently, or was it deliberately placed to confuse those trying to understand the murder? Each theory seemed more unsettling than the last. The greenhouse was no longer just the site of a crime. It had become a carefully constructed puzzle designed to challenge every assumption. Perhaps the strangest item found at the scene was a torn page from a travel brochure. The colorful paper, depicting a distant coastal town, seemed completely out of place. It offered no immediate explanation but hinted at connections beyond Ridgeway Valley. Investigators later discovered that the brochure belonged to a location Evan had visited multiple times, though no one in town had been aware of these trips. The presence of the torn page suggested communication, or perhaps a record, left by either the victim or the perpetrator. Every item, no matter how small, seemed to be a deliberate choice, carrying meaning only the killer fully understood. The timeline of events surrounding the discovery was equally perplexing. Security cameras from a nearby farm captured a vehicle passing the area hours before the jogger stumbled upon the body. The footage showed nothing unusual beyond the vehicle's movement, but a key detail stood out: the license plate had been removed. The act of erasing identification indicated forethought and planning. Whoever committed the crime had ensured there would be no easy trail to follow. Investigators realized that this was not a spontaneous act. It was calculated, executed with an understanding of how evidence would be discovered. As forensic teams combed the scene, they found fingerprints and traces of substances that did not match Evan. These details hinted at the presence of another person, someone intimately familiar with both the greenhouse and the victim. Every clue suggested premeditation, a carefully constructed plan meant to confuse, intimidate, or send a message. The greenhouse, once a forgotten relic of the town's past, had been transformed into a stage for a crime so deliberate and disturbing that even seasoned officers found it difficult to process. The combination of the luxury watch, foreign soil, torn brochure, and tampered security footage created a picture of a murder that was more than physical violence. It was a psychological statement. The killer had orchestrated the scene to unsettle those who discovered it, ensuring that questions would far outweigh answers. Ridgeway Valley, previously confident in its safety, was now confronted with a level of cunning and cruelty that shattered its sense of normalcy. The clues left behind were not just hints to a motive, they were challenges, designed to force investigators into a maze of uncertainty, where every discovery revealed only more layers of mystery and danger. As the investigation progressed, attention began to turn toward possible suspects, and one name quickly emerged: Caleb Rowen. He was a quiet mechanic who ran a small garage on the outskirts of Ridgeway Valley, someone most townspeople barely thought about. Caleb had no criminal record, no history of violence, and lived a routine life that seemed unremarkable. Neighbors described him as polite, almost withdrawn, someone who preferred machines and tools to human interaction. On paper, he seemed incapable of the brutal crime that had shattered the town, yet evidence began to accumulate that could not be ignored, forcing investigators to take a closer look. The first connection to Caleb appeared in the form of fingerprints found at the greenhouse. Among the strange objects near Evan's body, the luxury watch and the foreign soil, Caleb's fingerprints were discovered on the watch. The laboratory confirmed a match, leaving investigators both intrigued and puzzled. Why would Caleb touch an item that did not belong to him? When questioned, he displayed an almost eerie calmness, answering questions without hesitation, and offering explanations that seemed rehearsed. There was no panic, no fear, and no sign of guilt in his demeanor. The officers began to sense that his composed exterior was hiding something, but exactly what remained unclear. His behavior made the case more disturbing rather than easier to solve. The soil found at the crime scene added another layer of complexity. Forensic analysis showed that it matched the type of dirt found in Caleb's backyard, a fact that strengthened suspicion but also deepened the mystery. Caleb had no obvious motive for killing Evan Carver, and yet the physical evidence suggested a connection. Investigators wondered if he had been at the greenhouse for an unrelated reason or if there was a deeper involvement they had yet to uncover. The calmness that Caleb exhibited in the face of mounting evidence created a tension that unsettled everyone around him. It was unusual for a suspect to remain so composed, especially given the brutality of the crime. As police dug further into Caleb's past, they found traces of connections to Evan's hidden life. Caleb had been hired by Evan for repairs on vehicles used in secret deliveries. On the surface, these were ordinary transactions, part of his job as a mechanic, but the timing and nature of these repairs suggested that Caleb had access to knowledge about Evan's clandestine activities. This raised questions. Did Caleb act out of self-preservation, revenge, or something else entirely? Every piece of evidence seemed to point in multiple directions, creating a sense of unease for investigators trying to decipher his true intentions. Despite the growing suspicion, nothing conclusively linked Caleb to the murder itself. There were no witnesses, no direct traces of violence connecting him to the scene, and no clear motive beyond circumstantial evidence. His calm behavior, combined with the partial evidence against him, made him simultaneously a likely suspect and a frustratingly elusive figure. Investigators began to suspect that he might know more than he was revealing, or that the crime involved more layers than they initially imagined. Caleb's presence in the case created a tension that permeated the investigation. It became clear that solving this murder would require unraveling not only the crime itself, but the psychology of the people connected to it. As Ridgeway Valley watched, the town realized that the killer might not be someone they could easily identify. Caleb Rowen, the quiet mechanic, became a symbol of how appearances could deceive. While he seemed ordinary and harmless, the evidence suggested that beneath the surface lay secrets that could explain or complicate the brutal reality of Evan Carver's death. The investigation was no longer just about finding a murderer. It had become a psychological puzzle, testing the limits of logic, suspicion, and human understanding. Every calm gesture, every unanswered question made the case more sinister, leaving everyone wondering who, if anyone, could have committed such a shocking act. The investigation took a dramatic turn when forensic teams discovered traces of a rare cleaning chemical on Evan Carver's clothing. The chemical was not commonly used and was found only in a single company within the region, one that investigators quickly identified as belonging to Evan himself. This revelation added an entirely new layer to the case. It suggested that Evan had been handling materials far more dangerous than previously understood. The chemical, combined with evidence of his secret travels and hidden communications, painted a picture of a man who had been living on the edge of the law for reasons that were only beginning to surface. What had once seemed like an isolated act of violence now hinted at a web of dangerous connections that extended beyond Ridgeway Valley. Further examination revealed that Caleb Rowen's link to Evan was deeper than anyone had anticipated. Records and financial documents indicated that Caleb had been hired months earlier by Evan to repair vehicles used for secret deliveries connected to the chemical. The repairs were minor on the surface, engine work, tire replacements, but the vehicles themselves were instrumental in moving substances whose legality was questionable at best. This discovery shifted the perspective of the investigation. Caleb was no longer just a potential suspect. He was part of a network that operated in secrecy, and his interactions with Evan suggested a history that was fraught with tension and risk. The question now was whether Caleb had acted out of desperation, loyalty, fear, or revenge. The investigators began to see a pattern forming. Evan had been careful, meticulous even, in covering his tracks. His double life involved not just clandestine deliveries but also financial dealings that kept him insulated from direct suspicion. The rare chemical became a key piece of evidence, revealing that the murder was not simply a personal dispute, but likely tied to these hidden operations. Tracing the source of the chemical led investigators to documents and records that highlighted Evan's involvement in illegal transactions. Caleb, by virtue of his work with the vehicles, had been privy to this secret world, possibly aware of the risks it entailed. It was becoming evident that the confrontation at the greenhouse was no accident. It had been set against the backdrop of betrayal and secrets that both men had carried for months. Records also suggested that Evan may have been planning to implicate Caleb in his illegal activities. Hidden ledgers, receipts, and correspondence revealed a deliberate attempt to create a trail that could shift suspicion away from Evan and onto others involved. Whether Caleb discovered this plan before or after the confrontation remains uncertain, but it became a critical piece of understanding the motive. Investigators concluded that the meeting at the greenhouse was likely the result of a confrontation, one fueled by the realization that trust had been broken and that the consequences could be deadly. By the end of the analysis, the case had transformed from a brutal murder into a story of hidden networks, deception, and desperation. The rare chemical, once an obscure detail, had unveiled a dangerous chain of events, linking Evan and Caleb in a conflict that escalated to deadly violence. The investigators realized that this was not a random act. It was a consequence of calculated decisions, concealed lives, and secrets that could no longer be contained. Ridgeway Valley, a town once defined by safety and normalcy, was now a backdrop for a story that revealed the darkness hidden behind ordinary appearances, showing how greed, secrecy, and betrayal can culminate in shocking tragedy. Investigators turned their attention to a storage unit that Evan Carver had rented under a false name, hoping it would contain answers that the greenhouse scene could not provide. The unit was located in a small nondescript complex on the outskirts of Ridgeway Valley, one of those places people rarely noticed. Inside, the space appeared ordinary at first glance. Dusty boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture leaning against the walls, and the faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. But as the investigators began to go through its contents, it became clear that this unit was far from ordinary. It was a hidden archive of Evan's secret life, a repository of the clandestine activities that had ultimately led to his death. Boxes labeled with cryptic codes contained financial records, receipts, and bundles of cash, some of it in denominations that suggested long-term accumulation. There were also photographs, maps, and notes that tracked deliveries and contacts, revealing a network of transactions that spanned several towns. The investigators realized that Evan had not been working alone. His activities involved multiple people, some of whom remained unknown. This discovery added another layer of complexity to the case. It was not simply a murder in isolation, but part of a dangerous system that required careful planning and discretion. Every document and record suggested that Evan had been meticulous in covering his tracks, leaving only small, subtle traces that could point investigators in the right direction if they were able to decode them. Among the documents, one set stood out immediately. It contained personal information on Caleb Rowen, including addresses, vehicle records, and photographs. These files suggested that Evan had been planning to frame Caleb, possibly to remove him from the network or to deflect suspicion away from himself. The realization was chilling. Evan's death was not the result of a random dispute, but a violent confrontation triggered by secrets, betrayal, and foreknowledge. The storage unit made it clear that Caleb had been aware, at least in part, of Evan's intentions, which could have prompted the confrontation at the greenhouse. Further examination revealed recordings on a small digital device, capturing conversations and transactions that exposed threats, warnings, and tension between Evan and other members of the network. While the recordings did not capture the exact confrontation, they painted a picture of escalating conflict. Investigators began to understand that the meeting at the greenhouse had been far from accidental. It was likely a premeditated encounter where both men had awareness of high stakes. The violence that occurred there was the culmination of a simmering tension built over months, if not years, of secret dealings and mistrust. The storage unit also contained documents suggesting that Evan's dealings were more dangerous than previously thought, including materials that could be considered hazardous or illegal. This revelation explained why the confrontation escalated into such brutality. Caleb, who had likely known about the potential risks, may have felt cornered or threatened, and the struggle turned deadly. The evidence from the unit not only clarified the motive, but also provided context for the unusual behavior at the crime scene, from the carefully placed watch to the soil transported from afar. Every element that had baffled investigators now made sense as part of a larger, calculated plan. By the time the unit had been thoroughly examined, it was clear that Evan Carver's death was not just the result of personal animosity, but a violent collision of secrets, deception, and desperation. Caleb's involvement, the hidden network, and the careful orchestration of evidence all pointed to a tragic inevitability. Ridgeway Valley, a town that had once seemed untouched by danger, now held the remnants of a life lived in shadows, revealing how hidden motives and concealed truths can erupt into shocking and irreversible consequences. The storage unit became the key that unlocked the story behind the murder, exposing a reality far darker than anyone in the town had imagined. Caleb Rowen's arrest sent shockwaves through Ridgeway Valley. The town, once known for its slow pace and quiet streets, now buzzed with unease. For weeks, residents had struggled to reconcile the brutality of Evan Carver's death with the ordinary lives around them. The arrest did not bring closure. Instead, it exposed the complexity of a case that was far darker than anyone had imagined. Caleb was no longer just a suspect. He became a symbol of the hidden tensions that had been simmering beneath the town's calm exterior. People who had walked past him every day began to wonder how well they truly knew the people around them. Even with Caleb in custody, investigators were haunted by the sophistication of the crime. The careful placement of objects, premeditation, and the connections to a hidden network of illegal activities all painted a picture of a murder that was meticulously orchestrated. Every clue left behind, from the luxury watch to the soil transported from distant locations, now made sense in hindsight, but only partially. The psychological weight of the crime, combined with the meticulous planning, left even experienced detectives unsettled. It was a case that forced them to confront not just the brutality of human actions, but the darkness that can hide in ordinary lives. The townspeople were left grappling with a new reality. Ridgeway Valley was no longer the safe haven it had once been. Parents kept their children close, neighbors grew suspicious of one another, and casual conversations were tinged with unease. What had once been familiar was now shadowed by fear. The realization that someone who seemed ordinary could be drawn into, or even instigate, such a violent event shook the community to its core. People began to see cracks in the facade of safety they had taken for granted. It was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that danger often exists where it is least expected. For Caleb, the situation was complicated. His calmness during questioning and his involvement in Evan's secret network raised questions about motive and intent. Investigators believed that the confrontation at the greenhouse had been unavoidable once secrets were exposed. Both men were trapped in a web of hidden activities, deceit, and looming threats. The result was an encounter that escalated into a fatal struggle. In the end, it was a tragedy born not from a single act of impulse, but from months of secrecy, tension, and mistrust. Caleb's actions, whether defensive or retaliatory, became a mirror reflecting the consequences of living a life intertwined with deception. The case remained one of the darkest that Ridgeway Valley had ever faced. Even after the trial began, the story of Evan Carver's double life, the hidden network, and the confrontation with Caleb dominated conversations. The town's identity, once rooted in tranquility and safety, had been permanently altered. Ridgeway Valley became a cautionary tale, showing how hidden motives, betrayal, and desperation can erupt into violence that leaves lasting scars. The memory of the greenhouse, the storage unit, and the meticulously placed evidence became symbols of a reality that no one could ignore. Darkness can exist anywhere, even in the quietest corners of life. Ultimately, the murder was more than a crime. It was a revelation. It exposed human vulnerability, the fragility of trust, and the danger of secrets left unchecked. Ridgeway Valley had been forever changed, and the story of Evan Carver and Caleb Rowen served as a chilling reminder that even in the calmest towns, violence can strike when hidden lives collide. The investigation concluded, but the psychological impact on the town and its people lingered, leaving an indelible mark that would not fade with time.